Iron Bottom Sound, Where the Dark Belonged to Japan. August 8, 1942. Iron Bottom Sound, off Guadalcanal. The night is the kind of black that feels physical, a heavy lid over warm water, with only a faint smear of starlight and the occasional glow of a cigarette cupped in a sailor's hands on an American cruiser's darkened deck. Inside USS Helena's Combat Information Center, Seaman First Class Frank "Reds" Malloy leans toward a radar scope that flickers like a nervous heartbeat, headphones pressing his ears flat, sweat trapped under his shirt despite the night air, because the room is all machinery, heat, and tension, and everyone in the Solomons already knows what these waters mean. Japan's night fighting teams have been running the slot like it's their private road, and the phrase Tokyo Express is starting to sound less like a nickname and more like a warning. Malloy watches pale blips appear, then shift, then multiply, and for a moment he thinks it's sea clutter, islands, ghosts. Then he hears the calm voice of an officer behind him asking for range and bearing, and the calmness makes his stomach twist because it means the ship is trying to turn uncertainty into action. Somewhere above, on the bridge, lookouts strain their eyes into darkness while the sea stays stubbornly empty. And that mismatch, the radar's whisper versus the human eye's blindness, creates a dangerous pause where decisions should live. The Japanese force, under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, is already there, sliding in low and fast with cruisers and destroyers trained for this exact kind of work. Their crews drilled in night optics, flashless powder, and torpedo doctrine that begins with the long lance, a weapon the Americans still don't fully understand in range or lethality. In the Allied formation, ships are scattered between the tasks of guarding transports and guarding each other. Radios crackle with half-formed reports, and signals move slowly through a chain of command that is still learning how to fight as a team in these waters, in these conditions. Malloy reports contacts again, numbers, directions, the kind of information that should be gold, and a runner carries it forward. And yet the minutes leak away, because early radar is not magic by itself. Not if the fleet doesn't trust it. Not if the bridge hesitates. Not if communications discipline breaks down under stress. Then, without warning, the first Japanese shells arrive like doors being slammed in the dark. Orange flashes, the scream of metal, the deep concussion that you feel in your teeth. And suddenly, the night is no longer empty. It's crowded with violence. Flares blossom, turning patches of sea into harsh daylight, while the rest remains black. And in that ugly spotlight, American silhouettes become targets. The Southern Cruiser Group, ships like HMAS Canberra and USS Chicago, is caught with little time to react, and Mikawa's ships move with the confidence of men who have done this before, launching torpedoes before gunfire, letting unseen fish race through the dark while their guns begin to rake hulls that can't even see what's killing them. From Helena, the battle feels both immediate and distant at once. Immediate in the tremor of your own ship firing, in the clang of alarms, in the shouted damage control calls. Distant in the sense that you are fighting shadows, aiming at muzzle flashes and flare-lit shapes, trying to hit what the eye barely holds. Malloy's radar picture becomes chaos, returns merging, disappearing behind islands, stuttering as ships turn and smoke drifts, while above, officers struggle to decide what's real and what's trickery, because this is still the early war, when electronics feels like something that might lie to you, and Japanese night tactics feel like something almost supernatural. The sea fills with burning ships, and in the hot wind the smell of fuel and paint and scorched cordite rides across the water, and men begin to understand why these waters will be called Iron Bottom Sound. By the time the gunfire slackens, the Allied force is shattered, and the shock is not only in the losses but in the realization that the enemy's advantage is not a single weapon. It's an entire culture of night fighting, built on training, doctrine, and ruthless coordination. For Malloy, the worst part is the memory of those early contacts on the scope, those first faint returns that should have been warning enough, because they suggest a painful truth. The Americans were not blind, not entirely. They simply didn't yet know how to act fast enough on what they could see, and in a night battle, a delay of minutes can be fatal. In the months that follow, Japanese officers and sailors will continue to trust their eyes and their torpedoes and their night drills, and many will regard American radar with suspicion, something that seems like a gimmick until it starts to produce first contact and first salvo with an ugly regularity. While, on the American side, survivors of salvo will carry a different lesson back into every wardroom and training memo they can. The dark is not owned by anyone forever, but you have to earn it. And earning it will mean learning to trust a glowing scope, learning to talk clearly on the radio, learning to let radar and gunnery become one instinct. And as the Solomons campaign drags deeper into late 1942, Cape Esperance looming, Guadalcanal's night chaos coming, then the slow, hard refinement of radar-directed fire, you can feel the war preparing to flip a switch, because the moment an American ship detects first, shoots first, and coordinates faster, Japanese night mastery will stop feeling like destiny and start feeling like a habit that can be broken. October 11th, 1942. The waters off Cape Esperance at the northwest tip of Guadalcanal. The night is moonless and thick, and the sea is a black sheet broken only by the faint white curl of wakes as Rear Admiral Norman Scott's U.S. force creeps in column. Every ship running darkened, every sailor speaking softer than usual, as if sound itself could give away steel. In USS Helena's CIC, the radar picture is clearer than it has any right to be in this darkness, because Helena carries the new SG surface search radar, microwave, sharp, with a PPI display that turns invisible horizons into a moving map. And at 18,500 yards, the operator watches multiple contacts bloom on bearing 315. Not ghosts this time, but ships. Real ships. Steady and grouped, sliding down the slot the way Japanese forces have done it again and again. The men in CIC pass the bearing and range up through talkers and the TBS circuit, and for a tense stretch, the ship feels suspended between knowledge and permission because early American radar isn't the problem anymore. Decision is. Scott's formation has already made a confusing turn, and not every captain is sure where the enemy is relative to their own bow. And in that uncertainty, you can feel why Japanese night tactics have been so deadly. They don't require debate, only execution. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's night-running machine is in motion again. Rear Admiral Takatsugu Jojima pushing a reinforcement convoy toward Guadalcanal, while a covering bombardment group under Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto advances with confidence born of optics, drills, and the long-lance torpedoes' reach. And in those wardrooms, the Americans are still thought of as clumsy at night, too dependent on daylight, too noisy on the radio. Their electronics something you can outfight with skill and nerve. Then comes the moment that changes the tone. Helena requests permission to open fire, and the seconds that follow feel obscene in their slowness, because the radar plot is saying now, while doctrine and uncertainty hesitate. And when the order finally comes, the American column erupts, cruiser guns flashing, the sound rolling across the water like thunder trapped under the clouds. And the Japanese are caught in a way they are not used to being caught, without warning from the eye. The opening salvos hit hard and fast, slamming into the leading Japanese cruisers at ranges where, a month earlier at Savo, the Americans had seemed blind. On Goto's flagship, Aoba, officers on the bridge snap their heads toward the sudden flashes, trying to decide whether they're looking at friendly signals, shore guns, some trick. Then steel starts arriving, ripping through superstructure, tearing men off their feet. And the realization spreads in the worst possible way. The enemy has fired first in the dark. For the Americans, Cape Esperance is not a clean victory. Fire discipline breaks down, ships momentarily engage the wrong targets, and the night becomes the familiar chaos of muzzle flashes, star shells, shouted corrections, and torpedo anxiety. But it is the first time the US Navy in the Solomons feels the dark shift slightly under its feet. Radar contact leading to first salvo, the beginning of an advantage that is technological and procedural at once. Yet, the lesson is not complete, and the Solomon Knights keep punishing anyone who thinks one new device can replace training. A month later, November 13, 1942, in the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, radar again detects the Japanese approach, blips appearing on American scopes in the rain and near total darkness. But the information fails to move cleanly to the man who must act on it, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. Because communications discipline is shaky, radio equipment and procedures are imperfect, and the force has not drilled enough as a cohesive unit. So the contact advantage dissolves into a close-range melee lit by searchlights and star shells, where Japanese night drill and optics bite deep. And then, almost immediately, comes the counterpoint that shows what radar can become when paired with the right commander and the right habits. The night of November 14th to 15th, 1942, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, where Rear Admiral Willis A. Ching Lee's battleships, Washington and South Dakota, prowl Iron Bottom Sound with destroyers ahead, radar sets searching through weather and darkness until contacts begin to paint themselves near Salvo Island. The Japanese under Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo spot Lee's force and misidentify the big ships as cruisers, a mistake born of night optics and expectation, while Lee's force uses radar targeting to open fire first at range, and the battle turns into an ugly demonstration of asymmetry. When South Dakota suffers electrical failures that knock out radar and radios, she becomes a bright, wounded silhouette drawing Japanese fire, while Washington, not detected, closes into lethal range and hammers the battleship Kirishima with radar-directed main battery hits that cripple her, jam her rudder, and leave her burning and doomed. That is the moment Japanese officers begin to speak of American tricks with less certainty, because tricks don't consistently put first salvos on target in pitch black, and tricks don't let a ship that you cannot see walk heavy shells into your hull while you are dazzled by the wrong silhouette. And on the American side, the realization hardens into doctrine. Radar must live in CICs that talk clearly to bridges. The fleet must practice night maneuvering and gunnery as a team. And the goal is not merely to detect first, but to coordinate first, to shoot first, and to keep the fight at ranges where Japanese torpedo doctrine is blunted by confusion and time. By 1943, that learning curve begins to show teeth. More ships carry SG radar, more crews trust the plot, and commanders start letting destroyers operate with tactics built around radar surprise and disciplined torpedo attack, culminating later in the Solomons with actions like Vela Gulf, American destroyers under Commander Frederick Moosbrugger making radar contact, closing undetected, firing torpedoes before revealing themselves with gunfire, and shattering a Tokyo Express run with minimal risk. Proof that the night, once Japan's favored hunting ground, is becoming a place where American detection and coordination can flip the ambush back onto the ambusher. August 6, 1943, 20 hours, Vela Gulf, between Vela La Vela and Columbangara. The sea is a black, warm emptiness, and the air smells of rain and jungle rot drifting off the islands. And Commander Frederick Moosbrugger stands on the bridge of USS Dunlap with his cap pulled low, eyes adjusting to darkness that Japanese officers still believe belongs to them by birthright. In the months since Savo and Tassafaronga, the Americans have been bruised into learning, bruised by long lance torpedoes that seemed to arrive from nowhere, bruised by night contacts that vanished behind land echoes, bruised by CIC plots that weren't trusted quickly enough. Yet tonight, Moosbrugger's hands are steady because this time the plan is built around what the Japanese dismiss as electronics. SG surface search radar, centimetric, sharp, a tool that doesn't care about how good your eyes are, and he's finally been allowed to use it the way destroyermen have been begging to use it, independently, not tied to cruisers, not forced into awkward formations that blur responsibility in the dark. Below decks, in the CIC, The radar operator's screen is the only daylight anyone has. A green sweep painting islands as thick shadows and ships as bright moving cuts. And at 23:33, the contacts bloom on the scope like a curse coming true. 4 Japanese destroyers on a reinforcement run. Hagikaze, Arashi, Kawakaze, and Shigure, sliding down the slot toward Vila on Kolombangara with the same confidence their night crews have carried for a year, a confidence built on training, silence, and torpedoes so long-ranged that American officers once thought the hits must have come from submarines. Somewhere on those Japanese bridges, captains scan with binoculars and pride themselves on the discipline of darkened ships. And many still treat American radar as a kind of parlor trick, useful maybe for navigation, unreliable for war, because if you cannot see a ship, how can it be there? Moosbrugger's formation is split into 2 divisions that feel like clenched fists in the dark. His own destroyer Division 12, Dunlap, Craven, and Maury, will strike first with torpedoes, while destroyer Division 15, Lang, Sterrett, and Stack, waits to cover and then cross the enemy's course. The whole plan designed to win the one advantage that matters most at night. First lethal action without revealing yourself. And Moosbrugger, remembering the bitter lessons from Kula Gulf and Kolombangara, where radar contact and gunfire didn't automatically prevent a long lance from finding flesh, refuses to let gunnery announce his position early, because muzzle flashes are invitations, and invitations get you killed. The destroyers close, black shapes sliding through black water, with only the hiss of bow waves and the muted clank of a ship settling into a turn. And in the gun mounts, men hold their breath because it feels wrong not to fire. Feels like restraint when your instincts scream for noise. But torpedomen are already at their directors, hands on handles, checking gyro angles, waiting for the command that will send steel fish into darkness on faith and mathematics. At 23:33, the radar plot tightens, and Moosbrugger gives the order with the kind of quiet that makes it more frightening. Launch. And in the space of just over a minute, his 3 ships fire a mass salvo. 24 Mark 15 torpedoes. Then peel away to starboard at high speed, using the dark bulk of Kolombangara like a curtain. The Japanese still see nothing, because as later accounts would note, none of the Japanese destroyers in this engagement carried radar, and the looming island helps swallow the American silhouettes even as the torpedoes run. There is a long, sickening pause that always follows a torpedo salvo, seconds where everyone is watching emptiness and imagining failure, when suddenly the darkness ahead erupts. Flat, violent flashes low on the water, not like gunfire but like the sea itself has been punched, and the first Japanese destroyer blossoms into fire. Then another, flames reflecting off wave tops as if the ocean has caught. Hagikaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze are struck and mortally damaged, bursting into burning chaos so fast that crews barely have time to understand what hit them, and only Shigure, hit by a torpedo that fails to detonate, manages to stagger away into the dark, her captain realizing with a cold shock that the ambush has been sprung by an enemy he never saw. Only now does Moosbrugger let gunfire speak, and the covering division turns to cross the enemy's course, 5-inch mounts flashing as they rake burning hulls and silence any resistance, the sound rolling across the Gulf, while Japanese survivors jump into water lit by their own ships. It is not a fair fight, not a duel of skill in moonlight. It is procedure and technology turning night into an execution, and the brutality of it is exactly the point. For once, the Americans are not reacting to Japanese surprise. They are manufacturing surprise and delivering it at torpedo range without warning. And as the last echoes of gunfire fade, Moosbrugger's ships remain untouched, their decks dry of blood and their hulls unshattered. An outcome that would have seemed impossible back when Tokyo Express runs felt unstoppable. In the minutes after the action, as destroyers swing their searchlights briefly and then kill them again, because you never know what else is out there, the men in CIC stare at the scope with a kind of reverence that would have embarrassed them a year earlier. Because they have just lived the proof that radar is not a trick if you train around it, if you discipline your fire, if you let detection become decision instead of debate. And somewhere far away in Japanese staff rooms, officers who once shrugged at American electronic methods are forced to confront an ugly new possibility. The dark is no longer a guarantee, because an enemy who can see you first can decide when you exist, and in night war, that means your finest training and your best torpedoes can be rendered useless before you even know the fight has begun. November 2nd, 1943, Empress Augusta Bay off Bougainville. The night is humid and restless, the kind that makes steel sweat, and Task Force 39, Rear Admiral Aaron Tip Merrill's cruisers and destroyers, slides along the dark coastline with engines throttled to a steady churn, guarding the newly landed Marines at Cape Torokina, because everyone understands the pattern by now. The moment Americans land, the Japanese will try to smash the beachhead by night with cruisers, destroyers, and torpedoes, the old Solomon's rhythm of sudden violence. Inside USS Montpelier's CIC, the air is hot with electronics and breath, and a radar operator watches the green sweep paint the coast as a thick smear, and then, out beyond it, small sharp returns begin to stack in a line that doesn't belong to islands or weather, a line with motion and intent. The contacts are far enough out that a lookout on deck would see nothing but black water, yet on the scope, you can already feel the enemy's approach, as if the sea has revealed a spine beneath its skin. The report runs forward, bearing, range, speed, and Merrill's staff doesn't argue with it the way men argued a year earlier, because Vela Gulf has already taught them what happens when you trust the plot and hold your fire until it matters. You get to choose the first moment of death. On the Japanese side, Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori is pushing down toward the landing area with heavy cruiser Miyoko, heavy cruiser Haguro, light cruisers Sendai and Agano, and destroyers screening. And in those bridges, the confidence is still there. The belief that American night forces can be surprised, that torpedoes and aggressive maneuver can fracture a line before American gunnery finds the range. And there's something else too, a lingering contempt mixed with unease about American electronics, because dismissing radar as a trick is easier than admitting a machine might outsee a trained eye, but the war's recent nights have been whispering that this trick keeps producing first salvos and well-timed torpedo spreads. Merrill's destroyers are ahead, radar-directed, their captains listening to talkers and watching repeaters, as if their sensors now include a glowing circle that never blinks. And when the enemy comes within planned range, the Americans do what they have trained themselves to do. Launch torpedoes first, quietly, letting Mark 15 slide into darkness. Then open gunfire in a controlled burst meant to overwhelm command and range finding. The first American salvos crash out, 6-inch and 5-inch flashes briefly painting ships and sea into harsh negatives, and the night becomes that familiar strobing chaos. Muzzle blasts, star shells, the distant drum of detonations. Yet under the chaos there's a new order that the Japanese can feel and hate. The Americans are not firing blind, not searching with light. They're firing because their scopes already told them where the enemy is, and their directors are keeping the solution as the ships maneuver. Omori's formation lurches as confusion spreads. Japanese ships turn to avoid torpedoes they suspect but cannot see. Columns cross. Destroyers slip out of position. And for a few critical minutes, the advantage that Japanese night doctrine depended on, coordinated surprise, is smeared into uncertainty. Sendai is caught in the American gunfire and begins to burn, and you can imagine the bridge of that light cruiser lit by internal flame, officers shouting over the roar, trying to return fire at targets that appear and vanish between bursts, while American cruisers, guided by radar contact reports and tight voice procedure, keep walking shells into the same wounded silhouette. At the same time, Japanese heavy cruisers try to bring their guns to bear, but every course change and moment of disorganization steals the very thing a night torpedo force needs: clean geometry and confident timing. American destroyers dart and turn on plotted tracks, firing, then shifting, not because they're improvising, but because their commanders have rehearsed a new rhythm where radar is the conductor and torpedoes and gunfire follow the beat. The battle is not one-sided. No night fight in the Solomons ever is, and there are collisions and near collisions, ships missing each other by yards in the dark as both sides maneuver violently. And in that chaos, you see how thin the margin still is between radar advantage and catastrophe. Because radar can tell you what exists, but it can't automatically prevent a captain from turning into another ship when adrenaline and darkness compress time. Still, the trend is unmistakable. The Americans keep their cohesion long enough to maintain concentrated fire, and the Japanese, deprived of the clean opening they expected, begin to bleed ships and initiative. Eventually, Omori, believing he faces a stronger force and seeing Sendai crippled and destroyers in trouble, turns away from the beachhead. Away from the Marines he came to smash, because the night has become dangerous in a new way, a way that feels unnatural to men raised on the idea that darkness is cover. When the firing dwindles and the ships separate, the water is littered with burning wreckage and drifting survivors, and Merrill's force is still between Bougainville and the enemy, still functioning, still guarding the landing as dawn creeps toward the horizon. Afterward, the reports will reduce the fight into tracks and salvos and damage assessments. But the emotional truth on both sides is sharper than any chart. For the Americans, this is another proof that radar, paired with disciplined communications, practiced night maneuvering, and a doctrine that prioritizes torpedoes and coordinated fire, can break the old spell of Japanese night mastery. For the Japanese, it is another night where surprise fails to materialize, where the trick seems to see through black water and choose the moment to strike. And each time that happens, the psychological balance shifts a little more, because the Solomons had been a place where Japan's surface forces could still hurt the US Navy badly, yet now the pattern is changing. Detection first, coordination first, first salvo, until the dark begins to feel less like an ally and more like an unpredictable space where American ships might already be aiming at you before you know you've been found. October 25th, 1944, Surigao Strait in the southern Philippines. The waterway is narrow and black, framed by the dark bulk of Leyte and Mindanao, and the air carries that damp, salty heaviness that makes every sound feel closer than it should. On the bridge of the old battleship USS West Virginia, reborn after Pearl Harbor, her decks bristling with new radar sets and modern fire control, Lieutenant Commander James Jim Lockhart stands near the plotting team, listening to calm, precise range calls that come not from human eyes but from radar, numbers that feel clinical against the looming reality that a Japanese battle line is steaming straight toward them in darkness. This is an old kind of fight and a new kind of fight at the same time. The last battleship line engagement in history unfolding like a classic naval textbook problem, yet solved by electronics and a year of hard-earned night doctrine. Ahead, destroyers and PT boats have already made contact, launching torpedoes into the strait like thrown knives, and flares and gunfire flicker briefly in the distance. But on West Virginia, the mood is different, measured, restrained, because Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's plan is to cross the T, to place American battleships and cruisers perpendicular to the Japanese approach and rake them as they come through a funnel. And the plan depends on seeing first and shooting with coordination, not on searching with spotlights like it's 1942. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura pushes forward with Battleship Yamashiro, Battleship Fuso, Heavy Cruiser Megami, and destroyers, their mission part of a desperate gamble to break into Leyte Gulf and smash the invasion fleet. And there is a fatal momentum to it, a sense of advance regardless, that mirrors Japan's earlier night offensives in the Solomons, but now collides with an American fleet that has been living in radar-driven night war for 2 years. Lockhart watches the plot tighten as blips creep up the strait, and he can feel how radically the psychology has changed since Savo. Nobody on West Virginia is staring into emptiness hoping to see a silhouette first. They are watching a scope draw the enemy's approach as a line of certainty, and when the range drops into the envelope, the ship's main battery is already aligned in the dark. Turrets trained, directors steady, the firing solution refined by radar data. The order to open fire arrives without drama, and then the night is ripped open by the deep, crushing thunder of 16-inch guns, muzzle flashes lighting the battleship's superstructure for an instant like lightning trapped in steel. The shells arc invisibly, and moments later, the Japanese line begins to take hits at ranges and with a speed of correction that would have been unimaginable for a pre-radar night action. Splashes bracketing, then straddling, then impacts, heavy shells tearing into Yamashiro, while American guns adjust with cold efficiency. The Japanese fire back, but the return feels scattered and late, because their night sensors are still human eyes and optics. And in this narrow strait under fire, with ships already being torpedoed and burning, the old night mastery becomes chaos. Destroyers vanish in smoke, Fuso is shattered and lost, and Yamashiro presses on into a killing zone where American battleships, West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and cruisers can pour radar-directed fire while also benefiting from the earlier torpedo attacks that have broken the Japanese formation. Lockhart hears the range numbers change rapidly as the plot team updates, hears the gunnery officer's voice stay steady while the ship shakes with each salvo, and he understands the brutal truth of radar-directed gunnery at night. Once the Americans have you on scope, and you are constrained by geography, you are being measured and punished faster than you can adapt. In Japanese wardrooms, officers had once dismissed radar as an American reliance on gimmicks, a trick that couldn't replace skill, yet here the trick is turning into annihilation, and the shift is not merely technological, it's institutional. The U.S. Navy's early failures in the Solomons forced changes in training, CIC procedure, doctrine, communications discipline, and how commanders trusted their plots, and by 1944, those changes have matured into a night fighting system that integrates radar detection, radar fire control, coordinated torpedo attacks, and rigid command sequencing. Surigao is not won by radar alone. Torpedoes, geography, and numbers matter. But radar is the amplifier that makes the plan work in darkness, making first detection meaningful and first salvo devastating. As the Japanese force collapses, the strait becomes a graveyard of burning ships and survivors in the water, and the Americans, hardened by years of night alarms, continue firing with discipline until targets fade or sink. When dawn creeps in, the tactical lesson that began as a painful whisper after Savo has become a strategic fact. The night, once Japan's sanctuary for surface raiders, has been industrialized by radar and procedure into an environment where American ships can detect, coordinate, and destroy with a speed that makes surprise a rare commodity. And if you imagine a Japanese officer in 1942 scoffing at electronics, then imagine that same officer watching Surigao's horizon glow with the fires of his own fleet. You can feel the moment contempt turns into something colder. Recognition that the balance has shifted, and that the old ways of owning darkness have finally run out of room to breathe. November 24th, 1943, just before midnight, off Cape St. George at the southern tip of New Ireland. The sea is black and smooth enough to feel wrong, the sky covered with cloud that hides even starlight, and the only true illumination aboard USS Charles Osborne is the green glow of a radar scope down in CIC, where Lieutenant Junior Grade Harold Hal Vance watches the sweep rotate like a slow metronome. Vance has the kind of job that didn't even exist in the Navy's imagination before the war, turning invisible returns into a battle plan. And he can still taste the institutional shame of 1942 nights when radar contacts were reported but not believed quickly enough, when command circuits tangled, when ships fired too soon and lit themselves up like targets. Now, with Commander Arleigh Burke in command of a destroyer squadron, the air feels different, not less tense, but more organized, as if the ship has decided that fear will be handled by procedure. Burke is on the bridge above, listening. To calm, short reports that move fast and clean, bearing, range, course, because this is what the Navy has been hammering into men since Savo and Tassafaronga. The dark doesn't reward bravery alone, it rewards clarity. And clarity comes from drills that make talking as automatic as breathing. The Japanese force is coming down the slot again, destroyers on a reinforcement and evacuation run, confident in the old night rhythm. And somewhere in their wardrooms, officers still hold on to a belief that American reliance on electronics is a weakness, a crutch that can be outmaneuvered by skill and instinct. But Vance's scope doesn't care about pride, it cares about reflections, and the returns are bright and steady, ships moving in a line that looks like intent. Burke's plan is ruthless in its simplicity. Detect first, approach unseen, launch torpedoes before gunfire, and keep the enemy from ever regaining initiative. And what makes the plan possible is not the radar set alone, but the way the ship behaves around it. No debates on the net, no delayed relays, no arguments between bridge and CIC, just a chain where information becomes action quickly enough to matter. Vance feels that speed in his own body. The moment he calls out a range change, the bridge repeats it, the torpedo officer adjusts, the helmsman turns, and the ship's bow cuts a new line through water without hesitation, as if the destroyer has grown an extra sense. When the Japanese finally appear as faint shapes against black water, it is too late for them to own the fight, because Burke's ships are already in position, already angled, already committed, and the torpedoes go out first, silent, invisible, lethal, while the gun crews remain disciplined, holding fire like a held breath. Then the night breaks open in sudden flashes as his land and Japanese ships burn, and what the enemy experiences in that moment is the nightmare version of their own old doctrine. Surprise without warning, destruction. Without clear sight of the attacker, a fight decided before it truly begins. Vance hears the gunfire start only after torpedoes have done their work, and the rhythm is controlled, not frantic. Short bursts, corrected quickly, targets tracked by radar, even as smoke and flame try to hide them. And the engagement ends with Japanese destroyers shattered and Burke's squadron largely untouched. The kind of clean result that would have sounded like fantasy back when American cruisers at Savo were caught staring into emptiness. Afterward, on the bridge, Burke's voice stays flat as he issues orders, but men around him feel what this represents. This is the Solomon's Night War turned inside out. The Americans now executing the kind of ambush the Japanese once treated as an art they alone possessed. And if you shift your perspective across the water to the Japanese survivors, men in the sea lit by their own burning ships, you can imagine the bitter thought forming in the minds of officers who once dismissed radar as a trick. Tricks don't repeat like this, tricks don't become patterns, and tricks don't keep finding you first. The deeper change, the one that makes these late 1943 actions possible, is that the US Navy has learned to treat radar as part of command, not an accessory to it, building CIC teams that practice until they can talk targets onto the bridge without confusion, teaching captains to trust the plot even when their eyes see nothing, and shaping doctrine around the idea that night combat is a sequence: detect, classify, position, strike, rather than a sudden brawl decided by whoever is brave enough to turn on a searchlight. The Japanese, meanwhile, are trapped by their own strengths and assumptions. Their night optics and torpedo skill remain dangerous, but without radar, they must still close to a range where the Americans can now choose when the fight begins. And each time the Americans begin first, the long lance advantage shrinks, because its greatest power was always in surprise. By the time you reach 1944 and 1945, the Philippines, Surigao, and the last surface thrusts, this process has matured into something almost industrial, an assembly line of night killing where radar provides early contact, fire control systems shorten the time from detection to first salvo, and disciplined communications prevent the fatal pauses that once doomed ships. And that's why the Japanese dismissal matters as a theme in this war's middle years. Because it wasn't only a technical misread, it was a cultural one. They had mastered a night-fighting world built around human senses and practiced aggression, and they assumed the enemy's machines were unreliable tricks. when in reality those machines were the seeds of a new kind of night battle, one where the side that could turn electrons into decisions fastest would begin to own the dark. When Vance finally climbs out of CIC after the action, his ears ringing and his throat dry, he steps into humid night air and looks at a sea that seems calm again, and he realizes the strangest truth of all. The ocean didn't change, the darkness didn't change, only the way the Americans learned to see through it did. Late November 1943, back in the Solomon's Chain, the nights keep arriving like they always have. Warm, wet, black. But the feeling aboard American ships is no longer the same, because the men now treat darkness as a problem they can solve, not a fate they must endure. In a dim wardroom on a radar-equipped destroyer, a young Japanese prisoner of war, an engine room rating pulled from the sea after Cape St. George, sits shivering under a blanket while an interpreter tries to coax out what he saw, and what he saw was not heroic in the way his Navy's training films promised. No dramatic searchlight duel, no clean torpedo strike launched from invisibility, but sudden destruction from an enemy he could not see. Shells arriving with a confidence that felt unnatural, and officers shouting in confusion because the old assumptions failed. The interpreter writes the answers down, and somewhere along the chain, an intelligence officer will underline the same words again and again. They found us first, because that is the essence of what radar and radar-directed procedure have done. At sea, American captains now talk about tracks and plots, the way earlier generations talked about binocular bearings, and the CIC is no longer a backroom curiosity, but the nervous system of the ship, the place where faint returns become decisions fast enough to matter. This transformation doesn't erase danger. Long-lance torpedoes still kill, misidentification still happens, and a single bad turn can still put steel into friendly hull. But it does change the balance, because it steadily reduces the Japanese advantage of surprise that had once made Iron Bottom Sound feel cursed. The Japanese surface forces, never truly defeated in a single night by radar alone, begin to find that every run down the slot is riskier, that the Americans are less likely to be caught sleeping, that even when the Americans make mistakes, they often recover faster because the plot is still there, still updating, still watching through rain and blackness. By 1944, in places like Surigao Strait, the night becomes less a hunting ground and more a funnel, where geography and radar and coordinated fire can combine into annihilation. A development that would have seemed almost absurd back when Japanese officers scoffed at electronics and relied on the romance of night mastery. And when you pull back to the human scale, the sailor at a scope, the talker relaying bearings, the captain trusting a plot he cannot see, you understand why the psychological shift mattered as much as the technical one. Once the Americans believed radar could tell the truth, they trained themselves to act on it. Once they trained themselves to act, the trick became a weapon. Once it became a weapon, the Japanese could no longer treat darkness as a guarantee, because darkness without first contact is just blindness. And that is the quiet ending of the Solomon's Night War. Not a single victory. Parade, not a neat final duel, but the gradual replacement of one form of dominance with another, as American ships learned to coordinate like machines in the dark and Japanese ships found that skill and courage could not always compensate for not knowing you'd been found until the first shells were already on the way. In the end, the irony is sharp enough to taste. The Japanese were right to believe that tricks alone don't win night battles. Yet they were wrong about what American radar became, because it didn't remain a trick. It became the foundation of a system, and systems are what modern wars are made of. As the Solomon's campaign fades into history and the wrecks settle deeper into Iron Bottom Sound, the night over those waters remains as black as ever, but it no longer belongs to anyone, because ownership in war is never permanent. It is earned, adjusted, and taken away, one lesson at a time, until even the most confident doctrine can be turned against the men who believed it was unbreakable.